She stood on the steps of the plane, looking back one final time at the country she'd called home for 20 years. Behind her lay palaces, power, and a life most people could only imagine. Ahead lay uncertainty, exile, and a future she couldn't predict. This is the story of a woman who rose from middle-class obscurity to become one of the most powerful women on earth, only to watch her entire world collapse in a matter of months. A woman who went from hosting world leaders in golden halls to wandering between countries that didn't want her, from appearing on the covers of international magazines to mourning alone in exile. But here's what makes Farah Pahlavi's story so remarkable. She wasn't born into this. She wasn't a princess waiting for her crown. She was an architecture student in Paris who happened to meet a king, and that chance encounter would change not just her life, but the fate of an entire nation. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Feel free to drop a comment telling us where you are listening from. We greatly appreciate your company during these quiet hours. This is a story that spans continents and decades, filled with power, tragedy, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. So who was Farah Pahlavi before she became a queen? And how did a woman with no royal blood end up at the center of one of history's most dramatic political upheavals? Let's go back to where it all began. Farah Diba was born on October 14th, 1938, in Tehran, Iran. Her family was solidly middle class, educated, comfortable, but far from wealthy. Her father, Sohrab Diba, was an army officer who had studied in France and valued education deeply. Her mother, Farah Gotbi, came from a family with Georgian and Azerbaijani roots, bringing a diverse cultural background to Farah's upbringing. When Farah's father died suddenly of a heart attack when she was just 9 years old, the trajectory of her childhood shifted dramatically. Her mother was left to raise her alone, navigating the challenges of being a widow in 1940s Iran while trying to maintain their social standing and ensure Farah's future. This loss shaped Farah in fundamental ways. She understood uncertainty, the fragility of security, the importance of education as a path forward when inherited privilege wasn't guaranteed. The young Farah threw herself into her studies. It was both an escape from grief and a practical response to changed circumstances. Education became the bridge between middle-class stability and real opportunity, and she excelled at it. She attended elite schools in Tehran, including the Italian School and Razi High School, where she demonstrated particular talent in art and languages. Iran in the 1940s and 50s was a country in transition, caught between tradition and modernity, between East and West. The Pahlavi dynasty, established by Reza Shah in 1925, was pushing aggressive modernization while navigating the complex politics of the Cold War. The young Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had succeeded his father in 1941, was determined to transform Iran into a modern, powerful nation. For families like Farah's, educated, urban, progressive-minded, this was a time of expanding possibilities. The old rigid class structures were loosening slightly. Education, particularly for young women, was becoming more accepted. Tehran itself was changing, growing more cosmopolized with each passing year. Farah's academic success opened doors that would have been closed to earlier generations. After completing her secondary education in Tehran with top marks, she did something that very few Iranian women of her generation managed. She won a scholarship to study abroad. In 1957, at age 18, she left for Paris to study architecture at the École Spéciale d'Architecture. This was an extraordinary achievement. Not only was she going to Europe to study, but she was pursuing architecture, a field dominated entirely by men. Her mother accompanied her initially, helping her settle into a small apartment in the Latin Quarter, but Farah would have to navigate this new world largely on her own. Paris in the late 1950s was the undisputed center of the world for art, culture, and ideas. The city was still recovering from World War II, but had reclaimed its position as a global cultural capital. For a young Iranian woman, it represented freedom and possibility in ways that even cosmopolitan Tehran couldn't match. Farah immersed herself completely. She attended lectures, worked on design projects, explored museums and galleries, absorbed everything Paris offered. She learned to navigate the city's metro, discovered small cafes where students gathered to debate ideas, and slowly built a network of friends from around the world. She maintained her Iranian identity, attending events at the Iranian embassy, staying connected to the small community of Iranian students in Paris. But she was also experiencing life beyond the constraints of home. She had dreams of becoming an architect, of returning to Iran to design buildings that would blend Persian architectural traditions with modern techniques. She sketched constantly, filling notebooks with ideas for structures that existed only in her imagination. Nothing about her background, her education, or her aspirations suggested royalty or palaces or power. She was simply a talented, hard-working young woman in a foreign city, navigating student life, managing a tight budget, and imagining a future as a professional architect who might contribute something meaningful to her country's development. And then, in early 1959, she was invited to a reception at the Iranian embassy in Paris. It was the kind of event she'd attended before, a gathering for Iranian students and officials, an opportunity to network and maintain connections to home. She had no particular expectations for the evening. That's when she met the man who would change everything. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was in Paris during a European tour. The Shah of Iran, king, ruler, a man carrying the weight of an ancient throne and modern ambitions. He was also, at that moment, a man in a deeply difficult personal situation. His second marriage, to Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari, had recently ended in divorce. The marriage had been loving, but ultimately failed because Soraya couldn't have children. In the dynastic politics of monarchy, this wasn't just personal disappointment, but potential constitutional crisis. The Shah needed an heir, and the lack of one threatened the entire legitimacy of the Pahlavi dynasty. When the Shah met Farah at that embassy reception, something shifted. By all accounts, there was genuine connection. She was different from the society women who typically surrounded him. She was educated, serious about her work, intellectually engaged, grounded in real aspirations beyond court life. She wasn't seeking his attention or trying to impress him. She had her own dreams, her own path. Perhaps that independence was precisely what attracted him. Their courtship was brief and intense. The Shah was 40 years old, she was 21. He represented absolute power. She represented educated middle-class Iran. He needed a wife who could give him an heir. She was young and healthy. But beyond these practical considerations, there seemed to be genuine affection developing between them. For Farah, the decision to marry him was monumentally complicated. Accepting his proposal meant abandoning her architectural studies just as she was approaching their completion. It meant giving up her dreams of professional independence, her imagined future designing buildings, her carefully constructed life in Paris. It meant stepping into a role she'd never imagined, becoming queen, living under constant scrutiny, taking on responsibilities she'd never prepared for. But it also meant something else. It meant security for her widowed mother. It meant elevating her entire family's status. It meant playing a role in Iran's future at the highest possible level. And perhaps, at 21, there was romance in it. Being chosen by a king, becoming part of history. She said yes. On December 21st, 1959, Farah Diba married Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi in a ceremony that captivated Iran and drew international attention. The wedding was broadcast on Iranian television, still a relatively new medium. allowing millions to witness the transformation of a middle-class girl from a modest background into their future empress. But beneath the celebration, beneath the joy and excitement, lay a pressure that would define the early years of Farah's life as queen. Everyone understood why this marriage mattered so urgently. Iran needed an heir. The Shah needed a son. The entire purpose of this union, in the eyes of many, was to produce the crown prince who would secure the dynasty's future. Farah was 21 years old, newly married, stepping into a world of palaces and protocol and expectations she barely understood, and the clock was already ticking. The wedding itself was a spectacle that blended Persian tradition with modern pageantry, designed to showcase Iran's emergence as a modern power while honouring its ancient heritage. The ceremonies spanned 7 days, each event carefully choreographed to maximise both domestic enthusiasm and international attention. Farah wore a gown designed by Yves Saint Laurent, then working as the chief designer for Christian Dior. The dress was a masterpiece of haute couture, white satin embroidered with silver and diamonds, with a train that required several attendants to manage. Her jewellery included a spectacular diamond tiara, and her dark hair was styled in the fashionable bouffant of the era. She looked every inch the fairy tale princess, even if the reality was far more complex. The Shah wore his full military uniform, chest covered with medals and decorations, projecting strength and authority. The ceremony took place at the Marble Palace in Tehran, attended by foreign dignitaries, Iranian nobility, military leaders, and government officials. The splendour was intentional. This wasn't just a wedding, but a statement about Iran's arrival as a regional power worthy of global attention. But behind the elaborate celebrations lay the intense, almost overwhelming pressure that defined Farah's new reality. Royal marriages are never truly private affairs, but this one carried the explicit, publicly acknowledged burden of producing an heir to secure the Pahlavi dynasty. The Shah's previous marriages had failed, partly because of this very issue. His first wife, Princess Fawzia of Egypt, had given birth to a daughter, but no son before their divorce. His second wife, Soraya, had been unable to have children at all. Farah understood that her primary duty, in the eyes of many, both inside and outside the palace, was to give Iran a crown prince. Newspaper articles discussed it openly. Court officials watched her carefully for signs of pregnancy. The entire nation seemed invested in whether this new young queen could succeed where her predecessors had failed. The psychological weight of this must have been enormous. She was newly married, adapting to life in palaces, learning the protocols and expectations of her role, navigating court politics, and all while knowing that her worth would largely be judged on whether she could produce a male heir. 10 months after the wedding, on October 31st, 1960, Farah gave birth to a son, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. The relief and celebration across Iran were immediate and overwhelming. Cannons fired in salute, celebrations erupted in the streets of every major city, and Farah's position transformed overnight. She had fulfilled the most crucial expectation placed upon her, securing the succession and validating the Shah's decision to marry her. But something remarkable happened in the years that followed. Farah didn't simply retreat into the traditional role of royal mother and decorative consort. She began to actively develop her own sphere of influence, one that would eventually make her one of the most visible and active empresses in modern history. She gave birth to 3 more children over the following decade: Princess Farah in 1963, Prince Ali Reza in 1966, and Princess Layla in 1970. With 4 healthy children and the succession thoroughly secured, Farah had space to expand her role far beyond the nursery. The Shah, for his part, seemed to encourage this. He recognized that Farah brought something valuable to the monarchy beyond her ability to produce heirs. She was educated, cultured, comfortable in international settings, and genuinely interested in arts and culture. She could be the face of Iran's modernization in ways that complemented his focus on economic and military development. And the role Farah chose was unprecedented for an Iranian royal woman. Rather than remaining in the background, she began to actively shape cultural policy and build institutions that would outlast her time as empress. In October 1967, something historic happened. During an elaborate coronation ceremony held 8 years after he'd assumed the throne, the Shah crowned Farah as Shahbanu, Empress. This wasn't simply a ceremonial upgrade of her title, it was the revival of an ancient Persian designation that hadn't been used in over a millennium, not since the Sasanian Empire fell to Arab conquest in the 7th century. The coronation ceremony was carefully designed to echo the grandeur of ancient Persia, connecting the modern Pahlavi dynasty to the great empires of Cyrus the Great and Darius. The symbolism was deliberate. The Shah was positioning himself not just as a modern monarch, but as the heir to thousands of years of Persian civilization. And by crowning Farah as Shahbanu, rather than merely queen, he was elevating her to a position of unprecedented status and potential power. But Farah's influence wasn't just symbolic. She began to actively involve herself in shaping modern Iran in ways that reflected her education, her exposure to Western cultural institutions, and her genuine passion for the arts. One of her first major initiatives was establishing the Iranian Academy of the Arts in 1968. This wasn't merely a ceremonial patronage, but a serious institutional commitment to supporting contemporary Iranian artists and bringing international attention to Persian culture. She commissioned works from Iranian artists, created exhibition spaces, and used her position to ensure that contemporary Persian art gained recognition in international galleries and museums. She understood something crucial about soft power. That cultural influence could shape how the world perceived Iran just as effectively as military might or economic growth. Under her active patronage, Tehran developed a vibrant contemporary art scene that attracted international artists, collectors, and critics. The Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which she founded in 1977, would eventually house one of the world's most valuable collections of modern Western art, including works by Picasso, Monet, Warhol, and Pollock. Her work in education was equally ambitious and personally meaningful. She established schools, supported literacy programs, and became a powerful advocate for women's access to education. She founded the Pahlavi University in Shiraz, which later became Shiraz University. For a woman who'd had to fight for her own education, who'd nearly completed an architecture degree before marriage interrupted it, these initiatives represented deeply personal commitments. She also established the foundation for the protection of historic monuments and sites, working to preserve Iran's architectural heritage even as the country was rapidly modernizing. This reflected her training as an architecture student. She understood the value of preserving the past, even while building the future. Beyond these institutional achievements, Farah became the public face of Iran's modernization in ways the Shah himself couldn't be. Where he represented military might and political authority, she represented culture, progress, and a more approachable vision of royal power. She could discuss art with European collectors, education policy with American officials, and Persian history with international scholars. She embodied the bridge between Iran's ancient heritage and its modern ambitions. She became a fixture in international media. She appeared on the covers of Vogue, Time, Paris Match, and countless other magazines, photographed sometimes in elegant Western haute couture, sometimes in traditional Persian dress, always poised, always representing Iran to the world. The comparisons to Jacqueline Kennedy were inevitable and frequent. Both were young, beautiful, cultured women married to powerful men. Both understood the power of image and used their positions to promote arts and culture. Both became international style icons, but there was a crucial difference. Farah wasn't just a first lady. She was an empress with constitutional standing and institutional power. She could launch initiatives, allocate budgets, make decisions that shape national policy in her spheres of influence. She traveled extensively on state visits, often accompanying the Shah, but also sometimes representing Iran independently. She met with world leaders, attended international conferences, and generally presented Iran as a sophisticated modern nation worthy of respect and partnership. By the early 1970s, Iran under the Shah seemed to be fulfilling its ambition of becoming a modern, powerful, prosperous nation. Oil revenues were soaring following the 1973 oil crisis. The economy was growing at extraordinary rates, and Tehran was positioning itself as a regional superpower and America's key ally in the Middle East during the Cold War. Farah's life during this period was one of extraordinary privilege mixed with genuine purpose. She lived in palaces filled with priceless art. She wore couture gowns and spectacular jewelry. She entertained world leaders and cultural icons. But she also worked, developing programs, visiting schools and cultural institutions, promoting Iranian artists, advocating for women's education. She raised her 4 children, attempting to give them as normal an upbringing as palace life allowed. She tried to balance their royal status with some understanding of ordinary life, though of course they grew up surrounded by servants, tutors, and the elaborate protocols of court. To outside observers, Farah seemed to have everything: power, position, purpose, privilege. She was living what appeared to be the ultimate success story, a middle-class girl who'd become one of the most powerful and admired women in the world through a combination of chance, intelligence, and determination. But beneath the glittering surface, forces were gathering that would destroy everything she'd built. And the very modernization and westernization that Farah championed and embodied was becoming, for many Iranians, not a source of pride, but a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. To fully understand what Farah would lose, and to understand why the revolution happened, you need to grasp what Iran was becoming in the 1970s. This was an era that many Iranians, particularly those who would later go into exile, remember as a golden age. Others remember it very differently. The oil crisis of 1973 transformed Iran's economy virtually overnight. When OPEC nations, including Iran, dramatically raised oil prices, Iranian oil revenues exploded. Money poured into the national treasury at rates that strained the government's ability to spend it effectively. The Shah launched what he called the White Revolution, a massive modernization program touching every aspect of Iranian society. Infrastructure projects remade the country. New highways connected cities that had been days apart by rough roads. Ports were modernized to handle increased trade. The Tehran metro was planned. New airports opened. The physical landscape of Iran was changing at breathtaking speed. The economy was growing at rates that made economists marvel and worry simultaneously. Was it sustainable? Could traditional Iranian society absorb this much change this quickly? These questions were asked, but often dismissed in the excitement of apparent progress. Women's lives in particular were changing dramatically, at least in urban areas. Iranian women could vote, attend universities, work as professionals, dress in Western styles. The family protection laws of 1967 and 1975 gave women more rights in marriage and divorce. These were real changes affecting real women's lives, though they were concentrated primarily in cities and among educated classes. Tehran itself became a cosmopolitan capital, its streets filled with new cars, many assembled in Iran's growing automotive industry. Shops stocked Western goods, cinemas showed international films, nightclubs and restaurants catered to an emerging middle class that had disposable income and wanted to spend it. Young people attended universities in growing numbers, many studying abroad and bringing back new ideas. The royal court was at the center of this glittering world. The Shah and Farah represented Iran's modern face, powerful, sophisticated, connected to global elites. They hosted lavish receptions attended by international celebrities. They traveled abroad and were received as major world figures. They projected confidence and success. The famous 1971 celebration at Persepolis, marking 2,500 years of Persian monarchy, was designed to announce Iran's arrival as a major power. The event brought together royalty and heads of state from around the world: Queen Elizabeth II, Emperor Haile Selassie, President Tito of Yugoslavia, Princess Grace of Monaco, and dozens of others. The celebration cost somewhere between $100 million and $300 million. Exact figures were never disclosed. Guests stayed in a tent city designed by a French firm, featuring luxury accommodations with period furniture and modern amenities. The menu included peacock stuffed with foie gras, roast lamb, caviar from the Caspian Sea, and champagne and wine flown in from Paris. It was meant to showcase Persian culture and Iranian capabilities on the grandest possible scale. Farah played a central role in planning and hosting the celebration. She ensured that Persian cultural elements were highlighted alongside the luxury. The event was supposed to demonstrate that Iran could match any nation in sophistication while honoring its unique heritage. But to many Iranians, the Persepolis celebration was obscene. Millions of dollars spent on a party, while ordinary citizens struggled with inflation that made basic goods increasingly unaffordable. The contrast between the champagne fountains of Persepolis and the daily economic struggles of most Iranians couldn't have been sharper. And this contrast revealed the fundamental problem beneath Iran's apparent success. The wealth flowing through the country wasn't distributed equally or even reasonably. While Tehran's elite lived in extraordinary luxury, many Iranians saw no benefit from the oil wealth. Rural areas remained desperately poor. Even in cities, inflation was making life harder for working people. The gap between rich and poor was widening, not narrowing, despite overall economic growth. The rapid modernization was also alienating traditional communities. Changes that educated urban Iranians celebrated as progress were experienced in more conservative areas, as attacks on their values and way of life. The Shah's reforms had weakened the power and influence of the clergy, reduced the role of Islamic law, and promoted values that seemed deliberately opposed to traditional Islamic teaching. The forcible unveiling of women in the 1930s under Reza Shah was still remembered with resentment. The current promotion of Western dress and values seemed like a continuation of that same disrespect for Islamic tradition. Many Iranians felt that their culture and religion were being systematically undermined by a government that valued Western approval more than their own heritage. And then there was the political repression. SAVAK, the secret police organization established with CIA assistance, monitored, intimidated, imprisoned, and sometimes tortured political opponents. The organization's reach seemed everywhere. Political parties were banned or co-opted. Elections, when they occurred, were neither free nor fair. Censorship was extensive. The press was controlled. Dissent was dangerous. For those who benefited from modernization, and there were millions who genuinely did, the Shah's authoritarianism seemed a necessary price for stability and progress. But for those excluded from prosperity or offended by the direction of change, that same authoritarianism became unbearable oppression. And crucially, there was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, exiled since 1964 for opposing the Shah's reforms. From Iraq and later France, Khomeini was broadcasting messages calling for Islamic revolution. His cassette tapes circulated throughout Iran, despite government efforts to suppress them. He spoke to people who felt left behind by modernization, who saw their values dismissed, who experienced the Shah's rule as foreign domination enabled by American support. Khomeini's message was powerful because it offered coherent alternative vision. Instead of the Shah's secular modernization, Islamic government. Instead of Western cultural influence, authentic Islamic values. Instead of monarchy, rule by religious scholars who understood and represented the people's true identity and needs. This growing opposition existed mostly hidden from view in the early 1970s. The Shah's government was strong, the military loyal, the economy growing. Farah, focused on her cultural projects and her public role representing Iran internationally, may not have fully grasped how deep this resentment ran. Or perhaps she, like the Shah and many in their circle, believed that progress and prosperity would eventually win over the skeptics. That modernization would prove its value. That opposition was limited to small groups that the majority of Iranians didn't support. This belief would prove catastrophically wrong. Looking back, the signs of impending crisis seem obvious. But living through events is different from analyzing them with hindsight. In real time, the late 1970s in Iran felt like a series of manageable problems rather than gathering catastrophe. The first serious tremor came in January 1978, when protests erupted in the religious city of Qom, after a government newspaper published an article attacking Ayatollah Khomeini. The article was crude and insulting, calling him a foreign agent and questioning his credentials. For religious Iranians, attacking a revered Ayatollah this way was profoundly offensive. Demonstrations erupted, and police fired on protesters, with several passing. In most circumstances, this might have been just another instance of government repression. But this time, something different happened. The unlives triggered a 40-day mourning cycle according to Shia custom. 40 days after the Qom deaths, memorial ceremonies became new protests. Police again used force, creating new martyrs to mourn 40 days later. This cycle, mourning ceremony, becoming protest, becoming violence, creating new martyrs to mourn, repeated through the spring and summer of 1978. Each iteration brought more people into the streets. What began as religious protest started attracting secular opposition groups, students, workers, merchants. The protests were growing and connecting different segments of society that had previously been divided. By summer, the unrest was spreading beyond religious cities to Tehran and other urban centers. Workers began striking. Bazaar merchants, traditionally conservative and religious, closed their shops in protest. Even oil workers, the source of Iran's wealth and power, joined the strikes, crippling the economy that everything else depended on. The Shah tried different approaches. He dismissed unpopular officials, hoping to channel anger away from the monarchy itself. He promised reforms, more political freedom, less censorship, investigations into corruption. He created space for criticism in controlled forums, thinking this would relieve pressure. None of it worked. The protests kept growing. The demands kept escalating. What had started as religious grievances and calls for reform was rapidly becoming revolutionary movement demanding the Shah's removal and the monarchy's end. The palace was receiving intelligence reports, but they were contradictory and confusing. Some advisors insisted the unrest was manageable, that most Iranians remained loyal, that a firm hand would restore order. Others warned that something fundamental was breaking, that the opposition was wider and deeper than anyone had realized. Farah watched her world beginning to crack. The cultural institutions she'd built were being criticized as symbols of Western decadence and disconnection from ordinary Iranians. The modernization she'd championed was being rejected as cultural betrayal. The international magazines that had celebrated her as a style icon were now filled with images of protesters and riot police. Her children, particularly the older ones, were beginning to understand that something serious was wrong. Reza was 17, old enough to grasp the political stakes. How do you explain to your son that the throne he's being prepared to inherit might not exist by the time he's ready to claim it? In September 1978 came the event that many historians mark as the point of no return. On September 8th, a massive demonstration in Tehran turned into a massacre when security forces opened fire. Black Friday, as it became known, took hundreds. Exact numbers were never established, but the scale was catastrophic. Bodies in the streets, hospitals overwhelmed, families searching desperately for missing relatives. After Black Friday, there could be no going back. The opposition had been radicalized by state violence. The middle ground had collapsed. Compromise seemed impossible when the government had just slaughtered peaceful protesters. The choice was becoming binary: continue supporting a regime that massacred its own people, or join the revolution demanding its overthrow. By late 1978, Iran was in chaos. Millions were in the streets during major demonstrations. Strikes had paralyzed government services and the oil industry. The military was uncertain and increasingly divided between those loyal to the Shah and those sympathetic to protesters. The government was barely functioning. And from his exile in France, Ayatollah Khomeini was directing the revolutionary movement with messages that were becoming increasingly explicit. The monarchy must end. The Shah must leave. An Islamic republic must replace the secular monarchy. These weren't negotiating positions, but non-negotiable demands backed by millions willing to fight and die for them. Farah's life had become a nightmare of uncertainty and fear. Security concerns meant her movements were severely restricted. Her children's safety was a constant worry. There were credible threats against the family. The cultural projects that had defined her role as empress seemed absurdly irrelevant as the country burned. And her husband, the Shah, was facing decisions that would determine everything. Foreign governments that had enthusiastically supported him when Iran was stable were now advising him to leave, at least temporarily. The idea was that his absence might calm the situation, might give space for a transitional government to form. The Shah resisted. Leaving felt like abandoning his people, his throne, the duty he'd been raised from birth to fulfill. But by early January 1979, staying was no longer an option. The government had effectively lost control. The military's loyalty was questionable at best. Revolutionary forces were preparing for a final push that could result in a violent overthrow. The palace was receiving intelligence that plans existed to storm the palaces and potentially harm the royal family. On January 16, 1979, the Shah and Farah made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. They would leave Iran. Officially, this was presented as a vacation, a temporary absence while the situation stabilized. They would stay abroad for a few weeks, perhaps a few months, and return when conditions permitted. Everyone understood the truth. They were fleeing, abandoning the throne, going into exile with no guarantee they would ever return. Farah spent her final hours in Iran gathering a few precious items. She took some jewelry, partly for its sentimental value, partly because they might need resources in exile. She took photographs of her children, and she filled a small bag with Iranian soil, believing that she would someday bring it back when they returned home. That bag of soil would follow her through decades of exile, a physical reminder of the country she would never see again. The wedding itself was spectacular, a 7-day celebration, filled with ceremonies that blended Persian tradition with modern pageantry. Farah wore a gown designed by Yves Saint Laurent, her dark hair styled in the fashion of the era, diamonds glittering as she took her place beside a man who represented absolute power. But beneath the celebration lay intense pressure. Royal marriages are never truly private affairs, and this one carried the explicit burden of producing an heir to secure the Pahlavi dynasty. The Shah's previous marriages had failed partly because of this very issue. Farah understood that her primary duty, in the eyes of many, was to give Iran a crown prince. 10 months after the wedding, on October 31, 1960, Farah gave birth to a son, Reza Pahlavi. The relief and celebration across Iran were palpable. Cannons fired in salute, celebrations erupted in the streets, and Farah's position transformed overnight. She had fulfilled the most crucial expectation placed upon her, but something remarkable happened in the years that followed. Farah didn't simply retreat into the role of royal mother and consort. She began to carve out her own sphere of influence, one that would eventually make her one of the most visible and active empresses in modern history. She gave birth to 3 more children: Princess Farah in 1963, Prince Ali Reza in 1966, and Princess Layla in 1970. With the succession secured, Farah had space to expand her role beyond the nursery, and the role she chose was unprecedented for an Iranian royal woman. In 1967, something historic happened. The Shah crowned Farah as Shahbanu, Empress. This wasn't simply a ceremonial title, it was the revival of an ancient Persian designation that hadn't been used in over a millennium. The coronation ceremony was designed to echo the grandeur of ancient Persia, connecting the modern Pahlavi dynasty to the great empires of Cyrus and Darius. But Farah's power wasn't just symbolic. She became actively involved in shaping modern Iran in ways that reflected her education and her exposure to Western ideas about art, culture, and social development. She established the Iranian Academy of the Arts and became a patron of contemporary Iranian artists, commissioning works and creating exhibition spaces that brought international attention to Persian culture. She understood that soft power, cultural influence, could shape how the world perceived Iran. Under her patronage, Tehran developed a vibrant contemporary art scene that attracted international artists and collectors. Her work in education was equally significant. She established schools, supported literacy programs, and advocated for women's access to education. She founded the Pahlavi University in Shiraz, later known as Shiraz University. For a woman who'd had to fight for her own education, these initiatives were deeply personal. She became the public face of Iran's modernization in ways the Shah himself couldn't be. Where he represented military might and political authority, she represented culture, progress, and a more approachable vision of royal power. She appeared on the covers of international magazines, Vogue, Time, Paris Match, photographed in elegant Western fashion or traditional Persian dress, always poised, always representing Iran to the world. Comparisons to Jackie Kennedy were inevitable. Both were young, beautiful, cultured women married to powerful men. Both understood the power of image. Both used their positions to promote arts and culture. The difference, of course, was that Farah's power was more direct. She wasn't just a first lady, but an empress with constitutional standing. By the early 1970s, Iran under the Shah seemed to be fulfilling its ambition of becoming a modern, powerful nation. Oil revenues were soaring, the economy was growing, and Tehran was positioning itself as a regional superpower aligned with the West during the Cold War. Farah's life during this period was one of extraordinary privilege and responsibility. She traveled internationally, met with world leaders, oversaw cultural institutions, and raised her children in palaces filled with priceless art. She seemed to have everything: power, position, purpose. But beneath the glittering surface, forces were gathering that would destroy everything she'd built. To understand what Farah would lose, you need to understand what Iran was becoming in the 1970s. This was an era that many Iranians, particularly those who would later go into exile, remember as a golden age. Oil revenues had transformed the Iranian economy. The Shah's government was investing heavily in infrastructure, building highways, modernizing cities, expanding universities. Tehran was cosmopolitan, its streets filled with new cars, its shops stocked with Western goods, its cinemas showing international films. Women in Tehran and other major cities wore miniskirts, attended universities, worked as professionals. This wasn't true everywhere in Iran. Traditional values remained strong in rural areas and among religious communities, but the visible face of modern Iran was dramatically different from the country of a generation earlier. The Shah positioned Iran as America's key ally in the Middle East, a bulwark against Soviet influence during the Cold War. Military cooperation brought advanced weapons and training. Economic ties brought investment and trade. Iran was, by most economic measures, thriving, and at the center of this apparent success was the royal family. The Shah and Farah represented Iran's modern face, powerful, sophisticated, connected to global elites. They hosted lavish celebrations, including the famous 1971 celebration at Persepolis, marking 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. That event, attended by dozens of world leaders and royals, was designed to announce Iran's arrival as a major power. Farah played a central role in these displays. She was the empress who could discuss art with European collectors, education policy with American officials, and Persian history with scholars. She embodied the bridge between Iran's ancient heritage and its modern ambitions. But there were cracks in this gleaming facade, cracks that would soon become chasms. The wealth flowing through Iran wasn't distributed equally. While Tehran's elite lived in luxury, many Iranians struggled with inflation that made basic goods unaffordable. The rapid modernization alienated traditional communities who saw their values and ways of life being swept aside. The Shah's authoritarian rule, enforced through Savak, the secret police, created an atmosphere of fear that suppressed political opposition but didn't eliminate it. And crucially, there was growing religious opposition. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, exiled since 1964 for opposing the Shah's reforms, was broadcasting messages calling for Islamic revolution. His cassette tapes circulated throughout Iran, reaching people who felt left behind by modernization, who saw the Shah's Western alignment as betrayal of Islamic values. Farah, focused on her cultural projects and her public role, may not have fully grasped how deep this resentment ran. Or perhaps she, like the Shah, believed that progress and prosperity would eventually win over the skeptics. Many in the royal circle convinced themselves that opposition was limited to small groups of malcontents, that the majority of Iranians supported the monarchy. They were catastrophically wrong. The first serious tremor came in 1977. After years of suppression, political opposition began organizing more openly. Intellectuals published open letters demanding reforms. Student protests erupted at universities. These weren't yet calling for revolution, but they challenged the monarchy's legitimacy in ways that hadn't been possible before. Then came 1978, and everything accelerated. In January, protests erupted in the religious city of Qom after a newspaper published an article attacking Ayatollah Khomeini. Police fired on protesters, claiming several lives. This triggered a cycle of mourning and protest that repeated every 40 days, according to Shiraza custom. Each mourning ceremony became another protest. Each protest met with more violence, each death creating more martyrs to mourn. By summer, the protests were spreading beyond religious communities. Workers went on strike. Bazaar merchants closed their shops. Even the oil workers, the source of Iran's wealth, joined the strikes, crippling the economy. The Shah tried different approaches. He dismissed unpopular officials, promised reforms, used force to suppress demonstrations. Nothing worked. The protest movement had taken on momentum that reforms couldn't satisfy, and violence couldn't stop. Farah watched her world beginning to crack. The cultural institutions she'd built faced criticism as symbols of Western decadence. The modernization she'd championed was being rejected as betrayal of Iranian and Islamic identity. The magazines that had celebrated her were now filled with images of protests and violence. In September 1978, a massive demonstration in Tehran turned into a massacre when security forces opened fire. Black Friday, as it became known, claimed hundreds and galvanized opposition into revolutionary fervor. There would be no going back after that. By late 1978, Iran was in chaos. Millions were in the streets demanding the Shah's removal. Strikes had paralyzed the government. The military was uncertain and divided. And from his exile in France, Ayatollah Khomeini was directing the revolutionary movement, his messages becoming increasingly explicit. The monarchy must end. Farah's life had become a nightmare of uncertainty. Security threats meant her movements were restricted. Her children's safety was a constant worry. The cultural projects that had defined her role seemed absurdly irrelevant as the country burned. And her husband, the Shah, was facing decisions that would determine not just their family's fate, but the future of Iran itself. Foreign governments that had supported the Shah were now advising him to leave, at least temporarily. The idea was that his absence might calm the situation, might give space for a transitional government to form. The Shah resisted. Leaving felt like abandoning his people, his throne, his duty. But by early January 1979, staying was no longer an option. The government had lost control. The military's loyalty was questionable. Revolutionary forces were preparing for a final push. On January 16, 1979, the Shah and Farah boarded a plane at Mehrabad Airport. Officially, this was a vacation, a temporary absence while the situation stabilized. Everyone knew the truth. They were fleeing. Farah carried a small bag of Iranian soil with her. She believed she would return. She never would. The plane that left Tehran carried not just the Shah and Farah, but also their 4 children and a small group of advisors. They were leaving behind palaces filled with priceless art, institutions they'd built, a life of absolute privilege and purpose. They were leaving with no clear destination and no certainty about what came next. Their first stop was Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat offered temporary refuge. But this was clearly not a long-term solution. They needed somewhere to wait while the situation in Iran resolved itself, or so they still hoped. What followed was a period of humiliating wandering. Country after country that had courted the Shah's favor when he was in power now refused to host him in exile. The United States, Iran's closest ally, was particularly reluctant. President Jimmy Carter's administration feared that accepting the Shah would complicate relations with whatever government emerged in Iran. From Egypt, they went to Morocco, where King Hassan II offered hospitality. But after a few weeks, Morocco requested they leave. The presence of the deposed Shah was becoming politically awkward. Next was the Bahamas, then Mexico. Each move was another blow to their dignity, another reminder that their power had evaporated completely. Farah's focus during this period was protecting her children from the psychological impact of their displacement. They'd gone from being crown prince and princesses to refugees, moving between temporary homes, uncertain about their future. The older children understood what was happening. The younger ones were confused and frightened. And throughout this wandering, news from Iran grew worse. Ayatollah Khomeini had returned to Tehran in February to massive celebrations. He declared an Islamic republic. The Shah's government was dismantled. Officials from the old regime were being arrested, tried, and in many cases, executed. The palaces where Farah had lived were being stormed, their contents looted or destroyed. Everything they'd built was being systematically erased. The personal became political in the cruelest way. Images of Farah and the Shah were torn down and burned in the streets. The cultural institutions she'd founded were renamed or repurposed. The art she'd collected was denounced as Western corruption. She was transformed from empress to villain in revolutionary propaganda, blamed for excesses and disconnection from ordinary Iranian struggles. In October 1979, the Shah was diagnosed with cancer. He'd been ill for some time, but had kept his condition secret, even from close advisors. Now, he needed medical treatment that required sophisticated facilities. After much deliberation and significant political pressure, the Carter administration agreed to allow him into the United States for medical care. This decision would have consequences neither the Shah nor Farah anticipated. On November 4, 1979, Iranian revolutionary students stormed the American embassy in Tehran taking 52 American diplomats hostage. Their demand: return the Shah to Iran to face trial. The crisis would last 444 days and fundamentally reshape US-Iranian relations. For Farah, this meant that even in illness and exile, they remained at the center of international crisis. The Shah, who had once wielded such power, was now reduced to a bargaining chip, his presence anywhere causing political complications. They moved again, this time to Panama, then back to Egypt when the Shah's health deteriorated further. Each move was more desperate than the last, each destination feeling less like refuge and more like waiting room for the inevitable. On July 27, 1980, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi died in Cairo, Egypt. He was 60 years old. The cancer that had been diagnosed less than a year earlier had progressed rapidly, and his final months were marked by suffering that neither wealth nor royal status could alleviate. For Farah, this wasn't just losing a husband, it was losing the last anchor to her former identity. She had been empress because she was married to the Shah. Now she was a widow in exile, her title a historical footnote, her children inheritors of nothing. The funeral demonstrated how completely their world had changed. In life, the Shah had ruled over millions, controlled vast wealth, commanded armies. In death, his funeral was attended by a modest gathering. President Sadat provided full military honors. The Shah was buried at Al-Rifa'i Mosque in Cairo, the same place where Egypt's former royal family members were interred. But there were no representatives from Iran's new government. The revolution had declared him a criminal, a dictator, a betrayer of Islamic values. To them, his death was justice, not tragedy. Farah's grief was complicated by anger and bewilderment. How had everything collapsed so completely? How had they gone from such heights to such depths in barely a year? These questions would haunt her for decades. She was now 41 years old, with 4 children to raise alone, no country to return to, and a legacy under assault from every direction. The wealth that should have secured their future was largely inaccessible. Frozen assets, legal battles, properties seized by the revolutionary government. But perhaps most painfully, she was watching her children struggle with an identity crisis that had no easy resolution. Who were they now? Former royalty? Iranian exiles? Simply the children of a controversial historical figure. Her son Reza was nearly 20, and by some interpretations of succession law, he was now the rightful heir to a throne that no longer existed. Some Iranian exiles looked to him as a symbol of legitimate monarchy, a potential future leader if the Islamic Republic ever fell. But what did that actually mean in practice? How do you prepare for a role that might never exist again? In the immediate aftermath of the Shah's death, there was brief discussion within exile circles about what Farah's role should be. Some Iranian opposition groups in exile declared Reza Pahlavi as the new Shah, with Farah serving as regent until he came of age. But this was symbolic rather than practical. There was no kingdom to regent over, no government to lead, no crown to wear. These titles existed only in the hopes of exiles who believed, or needed to believe, that the monarchy might someday be restored. Farah navigated this complicated position with careful dignity. She didn't pretend that these titles held real power, but she also didn't completely reject them. For many Iranians in exile, particularly those who had suffered under the Islamic Republic, she represented continuity with a time they remembered, whether accurately or not, as better. She became a symbol rather than a ruler, a reminder rather than a leader. Her role shifted to preserving memory and representing an alternative vision of Iran to the one being built by the revolutionary government. This meant attending events in Iranian exile communities, giving occasional interviews, maintaining relationships with international figures who had known her during her time as empress. It meant being gracious and composed even as she witnessed her legacy being systematically dismantled back in Iran. But the personal cost of this public composure was immense. Farah was grieving not just her husband, but her entire previous existence. The palaces, the purpose, the cultural projects, everything that had given her life meaning was gone. She had to rebuild identity from nothing, figure out who Farah Pahlavi was when she wasn't Shahbanu of Iran, and she had to do this while protecting her children from similar crises of identity and purpose. If the story ended here, it would already be one of the most dramatic falls from power in modern history. But Farah's suffering wasn't finished. In 2001, her youngest daughter Layla was found dead in a London hotel room. She was 31 years old. The official cause of death was determined to be an overdose of prescription medications, ruled as passing away resulting from depression. Layla had struggled for years with the psychological impact of their displacement. She'd been 9 years old when they left Iran, old enough to remember the life they'd had, but too young to understand why it ended. Growing up in exile, she'd battled depression and substance abuse, seeking help through various treatments, but never finding lasting peace. For Farah, losing a child was agony compounded by guilt. Had the exile contributed to Layla's suffering? Had the loss of their former life damaged her daughter beyond repair? These questions had no answers, only endless pain. Then, in 2011, another devastating blow. Her son, Ali Reza, was found dead in his Boston apartment from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 44. In the note he left behind, he mentioned the pain of being separated from his family and homeland. 2 of her 4 children dead by their own hands. 2 lives seemingly unable to bear the weight of being Pahlavi in exile. The tragedy raised profound questions about the cost of political upheaval on families, particularly on children. Reza and Ali Reza Pahlavi had been princes of one of the world's wealthiest nations. Then, overnight, they were exiles. Their identities were tied to a country that no longer wanted them, to titles that meant nothing, to a legacy that was controversial at best. Farah had to bury 2 children while maintaining public composure. Each funeral was attended by Iranian exiles who looked to her for strength and dignity. Each loss was both private agony and public moment. The personal became unbearably painful, yet she couldn't fully grieve privately because she represented something larger than herself to the exile community. She was expected to embody resilience, to represent the dignity of the fallen monarchy, to maintain hope for a future that seemed increasingly unlikely. Farah Pahlavi is now 86 years old. She divides her time primarily between France and the United States, maintaining residences in both countries, but truly settled in neither. After more than 4 decades in exile, she remains a woman without a homeland, representing a monarchy that no longer exists. Her daily life is far removed from the palaces of her youth. She lives comfortably. Various assets and properties secured before the revolution provide financial stability, but without the vast wealth and power she once commanded. She maintains a small staff and continues to appear at events in Iranian exile communities and occasionally in broader public forums. She remains committed to cultural causes, particularly preserving Persian art and heritage. She's worked with museums to ensure that Iranian art gets proper recognition and display. This work connects her current life to her former role. She's still championing Iranian culture, even if she can no longer do so from Iran itself. Her relationship with the exile Iranian community is complex. To many, particularly older Iranians who left during or after the revolution, she represents a lost golden age. They see her as embodiment of an Iran that valued culture, education, and modernization. Her presence at community events brings people who want to show respect, to connect with that memory, or simply to see someone who was part of history. But she's also a controversial figure. Younger Iranians, including those born in exile or who left Iran more recently, have complicated feelings about the Pahlavi era. They've heard stories about Savak's brutality, about political repression, about the corruption and excess that characterized the regime. To them, Farah represents not a golden age, but a failed system that contributed to the revolution that displaced them all. Farah herself rarely discusses politics directly. She gives occasional interviews, always measured and diplomatic. She speaks about culture, about preserving Iranian heritage, about hoping for a better future for Iran. She avoids inflammatory statements about the current Iranian government, while making clear that she mourns what Iran has become. She maintains a relationship with her surviving children, Reza and Farah. Reza has positioned himself as an opposition figure to the Islamic Republic, advocating for secular democratic government in Iran. He gives speeches, maintains social media presence, and networks with other opposition groups. Farah supports him while maintaining slightly more distance from explicitly political activism. Her grandchildren, children of Reza and Farah, represent another generation of Pahlavis growing up in exile. They're American or European in culture and upbringing, with Iranian heritage that connects them to a country most have never seen. For them, Iran is history and possibility rather than memory. Why does Farah Pahlavi still matter? Why do people still care about an exiled empress from a monarchy that ended over 40 years ago? Partly because Iran itself remains central to global politics. The Islamic Republic is a major power in the Middle East, involved in regional conflicts, pursuing nuclear capabilities, and locked in ongoing tension with the United States and its allies. Any discussion of Iran's future inevitably raises questions about alternatives to the current system. This is where Farah's son Reza becomes relevant. He's positioned himself as advocate for democratic change in Iran, supporting opposition movements while maintaining his royal identity. When protests erupted in Iran in 2009, in 2017 to 2018, and again in 2019 to 2023, some protesters were photographed carrying images of Reza or his grandfather. The monarchy remains, for some Iranians, a symbol of an alternative path. Recent protests in Iran, particularly following the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody in 2022, generated renewed international attention to Iranian opposition movements. Reza Pahlavi gave interviews, expressed support for protesters, and positioned himself as potential leader of a transitional government should the Islamic Republic fall. This creates renewed interest in his mother, the living link to the last monarchy, the woman who was empress. Documentaries are made about her life. Interviews are conducted. Historians reassess the Pahlavi era with the perspective of decades. And there's genuine curiosity about her personal story. Here was a woman who had everything and lost it all, who raised children through unimaginable transitions, who buried two of them, who maintained dignity through collapse and tragedy. Her story transcends politics. It's fundamentally human, about resilience and loss and the unpredictability of fate. For Iranian diaspora worldwide, she remains a touchstone. Whether they supported the Shah's regime or opposed it, whether they left in 1979 or decades later, Farah represents a chapter of Iranian history that can't be ignored. She's the last living high-profile figure from that era, a living connection to a world that photographs and films can only partially preserve. But this story can't be told honestly without acknowledging the controversy and complexity surrounding the Pahlavi legacy. The Shah's rule, particularly in his later years, was authoritarian. SAVAK, the secret police organization established with CIA assistance, monitored, intimidated, imprisoned, and sometimes tortured political opponents. Censorship was extensive. Political parties were banned or co-opted. Elections, when they occurred, were not free or fair. These weren't accusations from hostile sources, but documented reality acknowledged by historians across the political spectrum. The rapid modernization that Farah championed and participated in was experienced by many Iranians, not as progress, but as cultural assault. The weakening of religious authority, the emphasis on Western values, the visible westernization of Tehran's elite while rural areas remained impoverished. These created resentments that the revolution channeled into political force. The famous 1971 celebration at Persepolis, meant to showcase Iran's glory, was seen by many Iranians as an obscene display of wealth, while ordinary citizens struggled with inflation and limited opportunity. The event cost millions of dollars for a party that lasted a few days. Money that critics argued could have been spent on schools, hospitals, or infrastructure that would benefit ordinary Iranians. Farah's cultural programs, viewed charitably, were genuine efforts to promote Iranian art and education. Viewed critically, they were elite hobbies that benefited the already privileged while doing little for the majority of Iranians. The museums she built were in Tehran, accessible primarily to the wealthy and educated. The universities she supported admitted small fractions of qualified applicants. There's also the question of what she knew and when she knew it. Was Farah aware of SAVAK's activities? Did she know about political prisoners, about torture, about disappearances? She has always maintained that she focused on her cultural work and wasn't involved in security matters. Critics argue that willful ignorance doesn't absolve someone of responsibility when they benefit from a repressive system. Supporters of the Pahlavi era point to real achievements. Iran in the 1970s had growing literacy rates, expanding access to healthcare, developing infrastructure, and emerging middle class. Women had legal rights and professional opportunities that disappeared or diminished after the revolution. The contrast with the Islamic Republic, its restrictions on personal freedom, its theocratic governance, its economic struggles, makes some Iranians nostalgic for the monarchy despite its flaws. This isn't about determining who was right or wrong. It's about recognizing that Farah's story exists within this complexity. She was participant in a system that achieved some things and failed catastrophically at others. She benefited from and represented a regime that some Iranians remember fondly and others remember with anger. The revolution that displaced her was driven by real grievances from real people who felt excluded, oppressed, or offended by the monarchy. But the Islamic Republic that replaced it has also disappointed many of its own supporters, failed to deliver promised prosperity, and imposed restrictions that have driven millions to leave Iran. Farah herself sits at the intersection of these competing narratives. She can't be understood only as a victim of revolution, though she certainly suffered personally. She also can't be understood only as a symbol of an oppressive regime, though she was part of that system. She's both and neither, a human being whose life intersected with history in ways that were sometimes her choice and sometimes not. So what do we make of Farah Pahlavi's life? What does her story tell us? From one angle, it's a classic tragedy. A woman rises from middle-class obscurity to become one of the most powerful women in the world, only to lose everything in a revolution driven partly by resentment of the very system that elevated her. She spends decades in exile, watching her legacy demolished and burying two of her children, who couldn't bear the weight of being Pahlavi in a world that no longer had space for what that name represented. From another angle, it's a story about resilience. She survived the collapse of her world, raised her children through impossible transitions, maintained her dignity through humiliating displacement, and found ways to continue the cultural work that had defined her, even without the power and resources she once commanded. She's now 86, having outlived her husband by over 40 years, having witnessed transformations of Iran and the Middle East that neither of them could have imagined. Her story is also a reminder of how quickly certainty can become chaos. In 1978, she was Empress of Iran, secure in her position, planning cultural programs and state visits. 12 months later, she was a refugee, moving between countries that didn't want her, watching her husband die of cancer in exile. The speed of that collapse is breathtaking, and it's a story about the cost of political upheaval on families and individuals. The Iranian Revolution was driven by legitimate grievances and genuine desire for change. But revolutions have human costs that extend beyond the leaders they displace. Farah's children grew up in exile, disconnected from their homeland, carrying identities that no longer had clear meaning. Two of them couldn't bear that burden and chose death over the confusion of that existence. Those deaths can't be separated from the political forces that created their impossible situation. Perhaps most importantly, Farah's story demonstrates how history refuses to stay neatly in the past. More than 40 years after leaving Iran, she remains relevant because Iran itself remains unsettled. The questions that drove the revolution, about governance, about the role of religion in public life, about Iran's relationship with the West, about economic justice, remain unresolved. And as long as those questions remain open, the memory of what came before will continue to matter. Was Farah Pahlavi a symbol of progress? A cultured empress who worked to preserve Iranian heritage and expand opportunities for her people? Or was she a symbol of an isolated elite, benefiting from an oppressive system while remaining willfully ignorant of ordinary Iranian suffering? The answer is probably both, and the fact that both can be true is what makes her story so compelling and so painful. She's the last survivor of a particular moment in history, Iran's attempt to be simultaneously modern and Persian, Western-aligned and independent, monarchical and progressive. That experiment failed catastrophically. Whether it was doomed from the start, or whether different choices might have produced different outcomes remains debated by historians and Iranians alike. What's certain is that Farah Pahlavi lived through one of the 20th century's most dramatic reversals of fortune, lost more than most people could imagine losing, and somehow continued. She's still here, 86 years old, carrying memories of palaces and power and public adoration. She's also carrying memories of exile and loss and children buried too young. In the end, her life raises questions without simple answers, about power and responsibility, about progress and tradition, about what we owe to the past and what we sacrifice for the future, about whether intentions matter when outcomes are catastrophic, about whether anyone truly understands the forces of history while living through them, or whether we all only see clearly in retrospect when it's far too late to choose differently. Farah Pahlavi remains the exiled empress, the woman who was once one of the most powerful in the world, and who now represents a kingdom that exists only in memory. Whether that memory should inspire nostalgia or caution, whether the Pahlavi era represents lost potential or necessary ending, depends on whom you ask. The only certainty is that her story, from architecture student in Paris to Empress of Iran to widow in permanent exile, is one of the most extraordinary of our time. And as long as Iran's own story remains unfinished, as long as Iranians continue debating their past and imagining their future, Farah Pahlavi's life will remain relevant, controversial, and ultimately deeply human. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more monarch stories from history that continue to shape our world today.